Hey everyone, Duking3D here with another mask to review for you guys, and today I have for you this US Navy Diaphragm Mark IV gas mask. Nothing particularly interesting or nothing that people haven't already seen or heard about a million times before, but I have this one and it's actually currently for sale, so I guess I'll do a little bit of a review for you guys. So, a little history on this, bit of a background. The US is probably it's one of the very few major powers to have separate developmental sections for gas masks for the Army and Navy, and that meaning that the Army and Navy both use their own proprietary designs, not really proprietary, but just they have their each and own unique designs, and their development system is entirely different from one another and independent. The Navy Diaphragm series masks sort of got their beginnings after the First World War. The Navy was already kind of slow in terms of development of their gas masks. The first mask that they had issued sometime in 1917, the Mark I mouth canister mask, which was more or less a loose clone of the German GM-15 mask with small box respirator style mouthpiece and nose clip, was upgraded I'd say around June of 1918 with the Navy head canister Mark II mask after a few months of developing that. And that continued service into probably the early 1920s when the Army had adopted the M1 service mask and the Navy saw the superiority of the design and wanted to tinker with it. They used that for a little bit and they realized that they needed a bit more of a universal design to issue to all of its sailors who obviously have more need to use voice communication, and the M1 diaphragm mask was already existing, so the Navy pretty much just chose or preferred the M1 diaphragm mask over the M1 service mask. The difference between the Navy and the Army variants of the service and diaphragm masks is that the Navy ones will always have a spring-type harness instead of the Army's M2 style elastic harness with the felt head pad. And then the Navy diaphragm masks later on would also be made out of black rubber as opposed to the Army's brown rubber used with the M1 and M2 service masks or diaphragm masks. The Navy Diaphragm Mark I was obviously, as mentioned before, an adaptation of the Army M1 diaphragm mask in that it included a spring-type harness, and I don't think the internal rubber was changed. I don't think the Navy produced it out of black rubber, but however, I could be very wrong. And I do know the Navy canisters took a while to develop as well. The Navy, for quite a while in the 20s, just reissued Army canisters until sometime in the late 20s, early 30s, had developed their own canisters based off of the Army type, more or less, except they were painted gray. The Navy M2 or Mark II diaphragm was just again a reconfigured M2 Army diaphragm mask with a spring type harness, and in this case black rubber instead of brown, as mentioned before. And both of these diaphragm masks served the Navy well through World War II, but the Army at that point was developing injection molded rubber masks, and the Navy was no shortcomer to want to lead their development on that. So the first mask that they officially adopted using an injection molded rubber facepiece was the Mark III Navy diaphragm mask, which is very similar to the Mark IV, other than the fact that the eyepieces were more of a elliptical, narrowed shape, which I can only assume would help to aid it in the function of using optical devices. However, it was not an optical mask. The Navy did have their own optical mask based off of the Army M1, and the Mark III and Mark IV masks lasted well through World War II. I don't know when the Mark IV was introduced. Probably I'd say around 1940, 1939 maybe. The Mark III was present from 1937 onwards. So they were both introduced around the same sort of period. And then the Mark IV was probably the most widely produced mask, or not the most widely produced mask, but just the most common U.S. World War II mask, at least military-wise, because you're still able to find these things mint condition and unissued today, albeit they are fetching very ridiculous prices. I wouldn't pay more than $60 for an unissued one, but that's just me personally. So anyways, it's very common to find these, and I do know the Navy diaphragm mask lasted a decent while post-war. I believe they did not get retired until the late 1950s, early 1960s, when the Navy Diaphragm Mark V mask began to overtake it, and they just have a very unique place in history, and they're a very. It's really hard to mistake the Navy diaphragm masks. They are nothing like the Army service masks, because as you can see, you probably already noticed, but the Navy diaphragm masks have, or at least the Mark III and onwards, Mark III and Mark IV, most of the World War II Navy diaphragm masks have this unique feature where the canister would be suspended behind the head harness, where it has two hoses leading to the back of the head. There was plenty of experimentation with head canisters in the First World War, and most branches ultimately decided that it was kind of an ungainly and kind of, well, stupid design. But the Navy, being that they are not, really suited for field combat, and they don't need to have the largest of canisters, they don't need to have, they don't have to worry about a whole bunch of field gear to manipulate around. They basically just wanted mobility, and they wanted to not have a hose get in the way when they're working around the confines of a ship, so mounting the canister on top of the head was the next best solution. And that's the sort of the idea they stuck with until side-mounted canisters with the Mark IV were eventually adopted. And interesting to note about these Navy diaphragm Mark III and IV masks is after Pearl Harbor, a lot of these were reconfigured into Navy shallow diving masks, because the Navy they did have the Mark V diving dress, the standard diving helmet and suit, but that was often too cumbersome and ungainly to get into very confined areas when trying to salvage submerged ships in the harbor. So basically, what they did was they took standard Navy diaphragm face pieces, they put a metal disc that blanked out the voice diaphragm, they crimped out the spearhead valve, or the outlet valve tube, and what they did was they took off the type B2 canister, I think it's B2, and where's this other hose? And what they did was they took a piece of brass pipe, a T-fitting basically, and conjoined the two ends of the hoses together across the back of the head, and there was a little barbed fitting sticking out from that piece of brass pipe, and that would be secured to an air line, which would lead to a compressor on the surface or on the boat. So very interesting, the versatility of these face pieces, and I know that there's a whole bunch of other stuff that they got configured into. In fact, the face pieces were used with the Navy oxygen breathing apparatus, albeit slightly modified. Instead of being a head canister design, they had integrally molded TSO deflectors like the M2 and M3 service masks, and they just kind of went down to the chin where there would be a, it led to the rebreather apparatus. I don't need to get into all that, and I'm probably wasting my time here, so let's get on to the review. So this one obviously is not complete. This one was actually barn fresh, as I like to call them. Just ones that have been so neglected, tossed into attics, barns, and it was just covered in filth, covered in cobwebs. It just, everything wrong with it. And I did my best to restore it from the ground up. This was more of an experiment for me to see what I could do with my capabilities, and I learned a thing or two from it, so it all worked out in the end. But ultimately, I didn't get as far as I wanted to, but it is still a mile better than the original condition it was. So the eyepieces are not actually yellow. Before anyone asks, these are actually discolored from age. And as you can see here, I've got a nice U.S. Navy and universal size stamp on the forehead. Get a close-up of the eyepieces here, and the very peculiar TSO deflectors, how they jut out and then just conjoin to hoses. And then you can get a good look at the outlet valve, or the outlet valve tube, which is missing the actual M5 spearhead valve itself. And then really not too much else to see externally. And also worthy to mention is that these are the only, at least during World War II, this is the only military mask during World War II that MSA had a contract to produce. It's weird. You think Mine Safety Appliances, this big company, would have more to do with producing masks, but it wasn't really until post-war when they kind of got their they really got their stuff in gear and started being a sole provider of gas masks for the U.S. military. But in World War II, they were mostly preoccupied with producing the Navy diaphragm series and other oxygen breathing apparatuses, since that was their main trade. You can see the spring type harness on the back here, which is missing the metal clip, and it is spring type because this is not elastic. This is all metal springs inside these little loops here, and then these straps are just plain canvas. They're not elastic at all, so not the most comfortable design, but it works and it's fairly comfortable enough for what it needs to be, and not too much else to see about that. So I will invert the harness and show off the interior for you guys. There's really nothing to see in there, so it'll be kind of quick. And I should also mention that my example here is dated I believe, July of 1944, and it is made out of neoprene. So I mentioned this in the casual Mark IV restoration video, but anyways, here's the interior. Again, nothing really to see here. You can see the large speech cone that's supposed to redirect the voice into the diaphragm assembly there, and below that you can see the port for the outlet valve. And really, there isn't too much else to see. You can see the mild texturing of the facepiece and the rivets holding on the harness assembly here, and other than that, there's basically nothing, as I said before. So that's pretty much it to say about this. And again, I am actually selling this just because I don't really have a place for it in my collection, and if I really wanted to, I could get a better condition one. But this one I have painstakingly restored back to a displayable, wearable function, and due to it not having a filter, all you kiddos worried about, filter safety don't have to worry about this, because again, there's no filter on it. So I guess the current asking price right now is about, I'd say around $45, I'd have to say, just because of the labor I put into this. It's not really worth all that much, but most of it is coming in from, things I've done to it to make it at least presentable. So that being said, that's pretty much all I have to say on this. Just want to get a quick review out on this. So if you have any comments, questions, corrections, or concerns, drop them in the comments below. I'm Duke Nigga3D, and I'll see you all later.